it's an amazing documentary. It's called Buying the War, and it's an hour long, and it's an incredible examination of how profoundly corrupt the media's coverage was. But other than that Moyer show, they never once acknowledged this extraordinarily significant issue because it involves their role and what they do, and that's something that just cannot be spoken of. And so it's difficult to find people like the quotes like I just read from Evan Thomas, where people in the media talk about how they perceive their role and their function. But there are some times when you can break through that wall. There are certain extraordinary events that compel members of the media to address these criticisms and to talk about how they view themselves. And it's incredibly revealing when they do, because you don't have to rely on media critics like me anymore to hear that reporters are sycophantic with the government and that they view their role as amplifying government messages instead of investigating. They say that themselves. And one of the best examples, the most significant event that forced the media roaches from behind their wall and forced them into talking about their profession was when Scott McClellan, George Bush's former press secretary, wrote a book, and in the book, he actually mocked and criticized and derided the White House press corps, specifically in the American media generally, for being too deferential to the Bush administration. I mean, think about how amazing that is, that a press secretary to the president, whose job it is to hate the media and to think that every criticism is illegitimate and unjustified and unfair, actually wrote a book mocking the American press for being too deferential and too meek and too mindless and too uncritical in how it reported on the Bush administration. He basically was accusing them of passing along the lies that were flowing out of his mouth like a waterfall without ever scrutinizing them, simply passing them along. Well, that was just too extraordinary of an episode for the media not to address that rather humiliating accusation. I mean, to be accused of being submissive to the government by an online media critic can be ignored, but to be accused of that by George Bush's press secretary is pretty extraordinary. And one of the people who marched forward to address this criticism was David Gregory. And this was about 4 or 5 months ago. He was, at the time, nothing more than an NBC White House correspondent. He's since been promoted, I think in part because of what he said in response to Scott McClellan. But what he came forward and he said, and he went on MSNBC, and he said, well, this is a very serious accusation that Scott McClellan made, that we were too deferential to the Bush White House. And actually, this is criticism that the left has been making for many years, that we didn't do a strong enough job in scrutinizing the claims of the Bush administration in the lead up to the war and elsewhere. And I actually thought long and hard about that, he said, with his very sort of somber expression that he put on his face. And he said he contemplated it a lot, and ultimately he decided that these criticisms are completely off base. And the reason he said that the criticisms are completely off base is because it's grounded in an expectation that what the media should have done during the run-up to the war and during the war itself and other times when the Bush administration was saying things that were false, he said what people think we should do, what these people on the left thought we should do, is to stand up and say, wait a minute, what the government is saying is false, they're lying. And he said, you know, I'm sorry, but with all due respect, that's just not our role. That's what he said. And I still, to this day, find that I've written about it 100 times, and I will never stop finding that so amazing, because if you think about it, if it's not the role of journalists to tell the public when the government is lying and making false statements and what it's telling to the public, what is their role? I mean, if it's not that, you know, what is it? And you know, interestingly, it's not an aberration. I mean, right around the same time, Charlie Gibson and Brian Williams went on the Today Show to promote some sort of charity that Katie Couric had convinced them to go promote with her. And it happened to be the week that Scott McClellan's book came out. That wasn't planned. And again, Matt Lauer had the 3 major networks anchors there, and they were supposed to be there to talk in this sort of playful and frivolous manner about the charity, but he felt compelled, because it would have been too conspicuous if he hadn't, to ask them about this accusation that Scott McClellan made. And both Brian Williams and Charlie Gibson both said, I just don't understand that. I mean, we ask tough questions, we're journalists, and they are really convinced that their role was fulfilled during the Bush era, that their role was fully discharged because they don't actually, as David Gregory said, see their role as being to compare government claims to what the truth is. Instead, they're there to do what Evan Thomas said, which is safeguard the existing establishment institutions, and I think they ought to be commended at least for being candid for once about what it is they do. A couple other examples quickly about that I think really illuminate what the established media is. In 2007, Charlie Savage, who was a reporter at the Boston Globe, is now with the New York Times, he won the Pulitzer Prize for reporting on the Bush administration's uses of signing statements as an instrument for evading the law. And he did great work at the Boston Globe. He uncovered how radical those signing statements were, how lawless they were, the ends to which they were effectuated. And when he won the Pulitzer Prize, they wrote an article about it in the Boston Globe, and they interviewed his editor, and they said, why do you think this Pulitzer Prize was warranted? And his editor said, well, the reason I think that he won the Pulitzer Prize is because, and she said this with great pride, beaming, she said, Charlie doesn't just write what the White House says, he actually writes what the White House does. And, you know, it's true, he does write what the White House not only says, but what the White House does, and it's true that that's sort of a good thing to do. But you would think that the practice of not just writing what the White House says, but actually writing what the White House does, would be so basic to what journalism is, that it wouldn't even need to be something that would be pointed out or praised. It would sort of be like the phrase independent journalism. I mean, of course journalists not only write about what the White House says, but also what the White House does. And yet, in our world of corporate media, if you actually write about not only what the White House says, but what the White House does, you are extraordinarily rare. In fact, you're Pulitzer-worthy to engage in what I think ought to be the most basic function.